I used to fantasize with my first girlfriend about the day that we were going to become adults. We were going to break away from our small town and our families. We would get a car and driver's licenses and run away to another city where we could kiss each other proudly in shopping malls and diners and punch anyone in the face if they tried to harass us. This was our fantasy image of adulthood, kissing in public. And we used to think we were adults already at the age of 14. We made adult decisions without any adults to guide us. Our parents didn't really know what was going on, and we were both convinced that they would kick us out if they did know. So instead, we tried to become home and family for one another. We spent all of our free time together, and she became the only thing that I could focus on. This was the year that I stopped caring about school, and I learned to live without the support or input of my parents. And it wasn't that I was ashamed of who I was, and it wasn't that I was facing all that much hate or even repression. No one was even talking about people like me. I wasn't even using the term lesbian until a couple years later, and I definitely wasn't calling myself queer, which is now the only word I'll even use to talk about myself. So it couldn't have been hate that I was facing, because no one even knew enough to look at me sideways. And then, when I eventually did come out, all that I found was support. My mother even told me years later that she had known all along. But no one bothered to say anything when I was a young teenager, and I was trying my best to teach myself how to become a woman who loves other women. My story only shows the beginnings of what could have become an abusive relationship. We were obsessed with each other, but it was never quite controlling. There was the constant fear of outing one another, but we thought that it was made with love. And there was this sense of urgency and necessity that hung over every conversation, making me believe that my relationship was more important than things like my grades, or my other friendships, or my mental health. We didn't really know what we were doing, and so my first relationship made the lasting impression that this was, in fact, what love looked like. And it wasn't just me. While it would be easy to blame my learned behavior on personal circumstances, this would be too individual. Domestic abuse is the shared burden of the queer female community. The National Coalition Against Domestic Violence reported in 2006 that 50% of all lesbians will enter into an abusive relationship in their lifetime. The Center for American Progress elaborated in 2011 that not only was this number so high, but it was 100 times more than the number reported by straight women, which is grossly disproportionate, and both of these numbers are just too high. So why am I 100 times more likely than my mother, or my sister, or my best friend to end up in an abusive relationship? Well, abuse is a learned behavior, and it's learned partially through media. Media that depicts women and men committing violence against each other as normal and acceptable encourages behavior that mimics this idea. Shows like American Horror Story might come to mind, where domestic abuse is extreme and sometimes even murderous. However, media involving straight couples is very diverse, giving many examples of healthier relationships between men and women. Ben and Leslie on Parks and Recreation, or even Skylar White standing up to her dangerous husband on Breaking Bad, are both examples of relationships built on more equal footing. For queer women, media is still very limited. There are only about 6 television shows in the past 30 years that focus on queer female relationships. And since there are so few shows, each of these shows has gained a cult following by this audience because of their subject matter. Out of the 6 or so shows that focus on women in relationships with other women, 2 of the most popular ones rely heavily on the promiscuous lesbian trope. The L Word is a wildly popular show from the early 2000s that has a main character, Shane, who is eternally single and emotionally distant, all while sleeping with countless women. In this picture, she's the one that's licking her friend's neck. Lip Service is another popular show from the UK that reached American audiences when online platforms like Netflix got big. This show often follows the character Frankie, who is also eternally single, emotionally distant, and very promiscuous. The big problem with these shows is the repeated use of characters like Shane and Frankie. The trope is the same in both shows, with this character acting to reinforce a binary. The Shane-Frankie character acts the way we expect typical male characters to act. They're even both given gender-neutral, typically male names to reinforce this idea. They're both singularly interested in women, while other characters might be bisexual or more fluid. They both get away with promiscuity often, sometimes even cheating on their partners. And they allow their partners to engage in emotional intimacy often, without giving much in return. And both characters' behavior gets brushed off by their friends as typical and acceptable for these characters. When shows use the promiscuous lesbian trope, they're depicting these characters as desirable, independent, and confident. The message that's being sent is that their behavior is desirable, and that it can be emulated to gain independence and confidence. But in the real world, this behavior is abusive and misogynistic, though our characters are always forgiven, and it's never treated as abuse. The even larger problem with these shows is that they are catered towards a young, queer female audience. Growing up, I didn't meet another queer woman until I became one. The women on these shows were the first queer adults I'd ever seen, and so I learned to treat them as role models. I was willing to forgive any behavior that Shane or Frankie were involved in, and I did forgive these behaviors when future girlfriends treated me in the same way. Representation is important, but it must be accurate and it must be varied. When it isn't being varied, then it's vital that we're teaching these young women not to treat this media at face value. Television still remains largely independent of any sort of guidance or public discourse involving young women. These repeated images aren't accompanied by any sort of challenges or warnings, making them even more harmful to the young women that see them as role modeling tools. But while we can't stop young women from engaging with these harmful images on television, we can add some balance to these representations. We can bring literature for and about queer women into our classrooms, and though those representations may not be any better, we can encourage young people to think critically about them. Like with television, though, there aren't many young adult novels published about queer women. Still, I found two of the most popular ones myself when I was coming to terms with my sexuality: Annie on My Mind by Nancy Garden and Keeping You a Secret by Julianne Peters. It isn't shocking that these were the first two books I picked up, because they're the same books that probably would have been taught to me by a well-meaning teacher, had any of my teachers thought to bring queer texts into the classroom. These novels are both brought into the classroom oftentimes because of their inclusion of queer characters, in an attempt on the teacher and the school's part to be inclusive. These novels send out a very specific message, though, and it's the same message that has been coursing through lesbian literature from the pulp novels of the 1950s all the way to the queer literature boom of the 1990s and beyond. Most stories that focus on queer women end in a rejection from society. In some cases, characters are kicked out of their homes, while in others, women are publicly outed and then shamed out of town. Oftentimes, characters are rejected entirely and end up committing suicide. And these have all been common themes in lesbian literature since its inception, and both Annie on My Mind and Keeping You a Secret fall into this category. They each start out with this secret love between two girls and build to a climactic moment of rejection. In Annie on My Mind, the two girls are discovered by a school official and shamed for their relationship. Meanwhile, a set of lesbian teachers are also found out and are fired, which of course scars the girls emotionally. In Keeping You a Secret, one of the girls is kicked out of her home when the two are found out, and she ends up living in a homeless shelter. And this story of rejection is important. And it's doubly important to talk about in schools because this rejection is still a reality for many. But when these are the only stories being told about queer women, and when young queer women are being taught that this is the only narrative available, a sense of shame comes naturally. At the time that I read these novels, I thought that social isolation was normal. These stories helped to sustain me in my feelings of social rejection, and they taught me that my relationship was something to hide, and that if people did find out, I would be shamed, and lives could be ruined. The message that I received, the message that's being given, is that I had to stand by my girlfriend no matter what, because we would be fighting against the whole world to stay together. Queer women are taught not to speak up if something goes wrong. Speaking out means coming out and bringing attention to your relationship. And we're taught that the world is cruel. But our girlfriend is supposed to be good. So what do we do when our girlfriend is cruel? By teaching women that this outdated reality is normal and expected, we're teaching them not to trust in the very institutions that are trying to be inclusive by teaching these texts. Not only does this work to silence potential victims in unhealthy and abusive relationships, but it acts to create abusers. By telling women that they can't trust in the systems built to protect them, we're telling them not to hold themselves accountable to these systems. And when people feel as if they are above a system, they're more likely to act in ways that are harmful to themselves and others. By teaching women that they have no agency or support because of their sexuality, we're teaching them that they are powerless, and powerlessness breeds the need to maintain power and control, which manifests oftentimes in interpersonal relationships as abuse. Then, when they've taken in these harmful messages from the fiction taught in schools, and they've watched these television shows which equate power with using women unapologetically, they more easily turn to abusive behavior. And while the two things, taking in harmful media and becoming an abuser, are not permanently linked, the prevalence of harmful media for queer women explains, at least in part, the extremely high numbers of abuse among queer women. And while there are already many amazing organizations in place and legislation being passed to increase access of care for these victims and to raise awareness of this issue within the community, prevention must become a priority. Young women have access to this media, and they will seek it out in an attempt to find representation. It would be wonderful to see a high volume of literature about young queer women with varying and empowering storylines enter the market. And for the creators out there, and the writers, I encourage you to tell these stories and create new media for young women. And for the educators out there, I encourage you to bring these materials into your classroom. Because more importantly, we need to begin having conversations with these young women about the media that they're taking in. If we do decide to bring this literature into our classrooms, which we should, it needs to be accompanied by a critical eye and an open discussion about the social realities of today. Young women need to be taught that they have safety and support within their schools and agency in their own lives. They don't have to fear the social isolation that these characters faced, and they don't have to try to create a space of power by stepping over other women. And not only do they need to be made aware of this, but we as adults need to back it up by making sure that they can be open about their sexualities and their partners within these public conversations and settings. This will come more easily when we allow texts with queer characters into our classrooms and remain critical of the representations in them. If we can provide these young women with a sense of safety and inclusion, victims will be more likely to come forward, and abusers may be created less frequently. Right now, today, queer women are among the most likely people in America to end up in an abusive relationship. But if we can bring inclusive texts into our classrooms and remain critical of the representations in them, we can reduce abuse within the community and save lives. Thank you.